I'm Dr. Ian Ellingham, and I'm endlessly fascinated by what our predecessors built. Everything from buildings a couple of years old back to the creations of antiquity. I want to provoke you by looking at a remarkable 200-year-old area in Canada, one that does not fall into those routine patterns and rules about what a successful neighborhood should be like. My sense is there are many things that can be learned from this bit of urban structure. It might help to suggest some things for you to think about during this online excursion. What are the key physical, architectural, cultural, economic, and societal attributes of historical neighborhoods? You should try to consider them insightfully, beyond the simply descriptive. Consider how successive generations of inhabitants and users of an area have interacted with their physical, economic, and historical contexts to continually modify an area to meet changing requirements. Think about how specific neighborhoods work relative to larger urban areas. And ask how our society should act with respect to the creation of new buildings and renovations of existing buildings so as to be compatible with the various identified attributes of an existing neighborhood. When I was an undergraduate student, I spent a summer working for a Niagara Falls-based developer. After a meeting in the St. Catharines city centre, I thought it would be good to see a bit more of St. Catharines, getting a feel for what the place was about. After all, I was working on a St. Catharines retail project. I knew that interesting things happen near watercourses, so I took out the city map and found a promising area nearby. I drove by a lovely, well-maintained, forested park containing a cenotaph, around a curve past a large old white house that housed a radio station, past an interesting stone wall overlooking a valley, and then I was astounded by what I saw. I had encountered Yates Street, and one of the more interesting parts of it. There is a row of 3 fascinating houses, and going further along I found even more surprising houses, varying widely in size, design, and orientation. I didn't know that this community would become our home after we fled Toronto some decades later, and that our family would become immersed in a very special area. Driving along Yates Street that day, I found a very green and fascinating area, and still to continue to be intrigued by the lessons that can be learned from it relative to urban quality, community, and sustainability. First, some background. St. Catharines is the largest city in the regional municipality of Niagara, an area that tends to function as a single dispersed city. There's widespread integration of many services and businesses across the region, with people living, working, shopping, following recreational cultural activities, and sometimes attending school in different population centers. The region reported its 2021 population as about 478,000. This suggests that the region ranks somewhere about the 14th largest population center in Canada. St. Catharines itself now has a population of about 140,000. St. Catharines remained a prosperous but small community through the 1800s, so in 1901 still had a population of under 10,000. It grew to about 25,000 by 1931, but the major growth occurred through the 1950s and 1960s. The population in 1951 was just 38,000 and almost tripled to 110,000 by 1971. For the past 25 years, it has hovered around 130,000, but more recently has exhibited further growth. St. Catharines is now located on the south shore of Lake Ontario, although the original settlement, today the city centre, was some distance inland. Two watercourses defined historical St. Catharines, most notably 12 Mile Creek and its tributary Dix Creek, which is now largely buried under 1970s motorway. The intersection of Dix Creek and 12 Mile Creek has been long occupied. The origins of St. Catharines, once called Shipman's Corners, as an urban place, appeared following the American Revolution, when, in the 1790s, United Empire Loyalists came to Canada, with there being about 3,000 Loyalists in the area in 1800. Loyalists and soldiers were given tracts of land, so formed the basis of the population. Interestingly, some families, including some who currently live on Yates Street, still own the land their ancestors were granted at that time. As well, with a new border appearing after the American Revolution, Niagara saw the arrival of permanently stationed troops. Twelve Mile Creek, which, contrary to its name, is a substantial river that was, in the 19th century, used to directly power numerous saw and grist mills. Remains exist from that time, such as nearby Race Street, where the waters from Dix Creek were once channeled to drive the mills. The historical transportation link between Lakes Ontario and Erie was awkward, involving a long portage between Queenston and Chippewa, both on the Niagara River, around the Niagara Falls and Gorge. It's not surprising that local entrepreneurs would decide to build a canal between the lakes, with construction taking place between 1824 and 1829. This first canal was a major stimulus to St. Catharines and defined much of its evolution. Industry was developed along the canal, which followed the 12 Mile Creek through much of today's city. Yates Street follows part of 12 Mile Creek and has always had an intimate relationship with it. Given that the population of St. Catharines was only 30,000 in 1941, the various elements of the city were in close proximity. Indeed, one end of the Yates Street Heritage District is located at the major urban intersection of St. Paul Street and Ontario Street. This car retail and repair operation on Ontario Street, featuring Rios and Packards, abuts the Heritage District behind it. I like this photograph. The dapper individual, third from the right, was my great-uncle. The building remains in commercial use, but not as a car dealership. Much of it is now lawyers' offices. Through the 1800s, large spa hotels were created in and near the area, based on the mineral springs that seep out of the creek bank, and they cater to patrons across North America. With the relocation of the canal, the availability of electricity, and changing recreational preferences, the bankside industry and hotels faded away, and a period of transformation occurred. One of the spa hotels on Yates Street was converted to a ladies' college in 1896, and in 1916 into a factory that made 5 tons of macaroni a day. Over time, the area has continuously reinvented itself. The 1856 Welland House Hotel on Ontario Street burned in 2021 after many years of decline. In 2023, it still remains a pile of rubble. Let's go and explore the Yates Street Heritage Conservation District. Here is a map of the key elements of the Yates Street Heritage District. The district is near the city centre. St. Paul Street, the main commercial street, is to the right of the map, with Ontario Street, another main street, running across the top of the map, the two crossing at the intersection at the top right, where you see the blue arrow. During the First War, the high-level Burgoyne Bridge was built, and the southeast part of the area was rearranged. Today, St. Paul Street crosses 12 Mile Creek, also passing over Highway 406 that was built in the 1970s. Most of the Yates Street houses sit upon a top of bank adjacent to 12 Mile Creek. In old photographs, the creek was shown as a placid waterway with docks and children swimming. It is now a significant and vigorous watercourse due to the redirection of water through hydroelectric generating stations upstream. In the photograph on the left, you can see some Yates Street houses in the background on top of the bank, in a low area that used to have industrial uses, when this part of 12 Mile Creek was part of the first and second Welland Canals, and the water course was much less vigorous. At one end of the area, it's dominated by the New Burgoyne Bridge, high above both the creek and the highway. This bank means that many of the houses on the creek side of Yates Street are considerably larger than they look. Here we see the front and the back of one of the houses. This situation exists in other neighborhoods along the creek. This makes an interesting contrast to today's monster houses, where looking impressive seems to be the objective. Particularly in the 1920s, when the Niagara economy boomed, many managers, professionals, and business owners chose to make their houses appear more modest. Surprisingly, some of the entrances seem more suited to hobbits. The visitor will quickly notice that this is not an area of uniformity. Indeed, it is almost the exact opposite. We have become very used to the results of 20th century zoning, which, in keeping with its name, created zones for different uses, with requirements that created uniformity in building size, uses, density, setbacks, height limits, and parking requirements. But in the early days of this area, zoning, as we know it, did not exist. So in our study district, a mix appeared, ranging from huge houses, one has over 9,000 square feet, through middle-sized dwellings, to workers' cottages and duplexes, and more recently, a real purpose-built elevated apartment building. Not to mention the now disappeared macaroni factory. Multiple unit buildings have always been part of the mix, and even the modern multi-story apartment block manages to at least fit in, somewhat. It was built at a time when it was widely expected that such neighborhoods would eventually be cleared. In the early 1970s, St. Catharines had a central city plan that proposed demolishing most of it. Here are a couple of the more modest houses in the area. Remember that when these were built, the industry along 12 Mile Creek was very close, easy to walk to in those pre-car days. But let's look at some of the other interesting ways in which the Yates Street Heritage District differs from more recent neighborhoods. Indeed, many of the things that make it special and esteemed. One is the lack of a uniform setback. These two houses are neighbors. One sits almost on the sidewalk, and the other far back behind a grass lawn. You can see the hedges of the bigger house in the photograph of the smaller house. This is not an unusual situation in the area, and it's not discordant. The irregular nature of the streets, properties, and setbacks means that interesting spaces appear, along with some fascinating building details. Unlike in many more recent neighborhoods, the strolling person does not just encounter uniformity. So one can encounter quirky building details and mysterious passages. One of the quirks of the area are the wreaths, usually hung in the front doors, but sometimes over garages and in gable ends. This is not just a Christmas thing, and many people change their wreaths with the seasons. Have you ever seen this elsewhere? It seems like some sort of allegiance to a sense of community. It does not seem to be organized or promoted. I asked a few people why it happened, with no real answer. Apparently, it does just happen. Another feature is that while Yates Street itself is quite wide, the other streets are quite narrow, meaning that cars cannot pass each other. One has to act to allow cars to go by. This leads to automatic traffic calming, cooperation, and some sort of respect. One might appreciate as well the lesser amount of land given to asphalt. The photograph on the top right is a two-way street with parking on one side. It actually works. One thing that I find personally interesting is the variety of interfaces between dwelling and street. Post-war suburbs typically have a deep front yard with mown grass. In the Yates Street Heritage District, history has given many different interfaces. Indeed, some houses are set back behind impressive front yards, but cases in which the next house sits on the sidewalk can also be seen. This does not relate to house size or market price. As the area is heavily forested, many houses have something else than grass in front of them. Again, no uniformity except in the variety. I like the porches, and in places, the interface between private and public space is dematerialized. And here are a couple of examples. Another example is Captain Norris's house from circa 1850, and occupied by the Norris family for the latter part of the 1800s. It has a wonderful column side yard porch with a semi-octagonal end coming up almost to the sidewalk. The current occupants have set it up as an outside dining area. They can chat with passers-by. Here are a couple of more examples where the house patio goes up almost to the sidewalk, inviting people to chat or even come in for a drink. One remarkable house dates back to the 1800s and was extensively built in the early 1920s, but has a new street-facing outdoor area with the explicit intent of bringing neighbors together. The owners encourage people to come. Another compensates for its small lot by bringing their private space right out to the sidewalk. It's hard not to know your neighbors when they're sitting next to the sidewalk. Niagara has quite a moderate climate, and Yates Street is protected by the Niagara Escarpment. It's also on the sunny side of the Creek Valley. This means that many people seem to undertake gardening with a passion. Interestingly, as we will see, the Yates Street Heritage District has a considerably higher density in terms of people or units per hectare than the city as a whole, yet it seems overwhelmingly verdant. As suggested by the photograph on the right, having a minimal front yard might actually encourage landscaping. The landscaping is far from uniform. Different people have different approaches, and according to their preferences and the exact situation of their property, such as the one on the right, which goes where you can see the road going down the bank side, and so they have dealt with that with basically a huge, extensive covering of ivy. In a few cases, the dwelling is almost completely obscured by the vegetation. The landscaping is far from uniform. Different people have taken very different approaches according to their preferences and the exact situation and characteristics of their property. Walking is a healthy thing. We know that people who routinely walk have better health and live longer. The Yates Street Heritage District not only is it interesting walking in the area, but it's also a few minutes walk to many urban amenities, banks, restaurants, businesses, the Performing Arts Center, bookstores, including a wonderful used bookstore, the Central Library, religious institutions, and for obviously in Canada, the Hockey Palace. The percentage of population aged over 85 is 11.1% versus 3.5% for the city as a whole. Not only can people remain in their houses through their life cycle, but as some do choose, they can downsize without leaving the area. Many post-war suburbs in St. Catharines don't have sidewalks. The expectation is that the residents will always go everywhere by car. Yates Street is not only walked in by residents, but by many visitors. Just on the other side of Ontario Street is Montebello Park, seen in the photograph on the left. It's an Olmsted design. It offers many summertime activities such as Rib Fest, the Grape and Wine Festival, and frequent evening musical performances. And for the cyclist, or a more dedicated walker or runner, there are trails running below the 12-mile creek bank that run for several kilometers in each direction. The traditional city center is just a few minutes walk away. It's changed over the years, and no longer can you buy a pair of socks at Kresge's or Woolworth's, but you can find many places to eat and drink. Entertainment, banking, the library, government offices, many more things are easily accessed on foot from the Yates Street Heritage District. And this area is also interesting in itself because the street curves back and forth. It follows the top of the bank along Dix Creek and is a path that's apparently centuries old. One of the spa hotels is Springbank, but the market for spa hotels declined, and in 1888 it became Ridley College, a fee-paying school. In 1903, most of it burned, essentially leaving the service areas, including the laundry. Ridley College moved to the other side of the creek. The surviving bits were converted to housing in 1912 and renovated in 1980. Additional portions were added and 3 attached houses emerged, as shown here. The building is set back from the street behind wooden fences with a landscaped area in front. The rest of the site, left after the Ridley fire, was developed in 1909-1910 as a large single-family dwelling, and in 1998 it became a bed and breakfast. Working at home seems to have existed since Yates Street was created almost 200 years ago. Interesting, given today's revived interest in at-home work. In the 1800s, industrial uses were at the bottom of the bank, next to the old Welland Canal. Some owners and managers lived above. One example was a Taylor and Bate brewery. Various of the houses in the area were built or occupied by the brewery owners, as well as by lawyers, stockbrokers, and various entrepreneurs. The proximity to the city center meant that working from the home was very attractive. This became quite explicit in the booming 1920s, and some houses, such as this one, were specifically designed for at-home offices. In some of them, one enters the front door, and you can go in 2 directions, immediately into an office meeting space, or in a different direction to the main part of the house, separating business from the domestic reality of noisy children and servants. In this case, you can see the office area, and just to the left, under that little arch, you can see the entry to the house. One seldom thinks of neighborhoods with respect to their smaller scale, but some interesting details can be found in this area. Sometimes parking is, let us say, interesting, but one can usually find a place to tether one's horse, or in a couple of places, steps to climb up into one's carriage. The compactness of the streetscape means that people's attention to their own properties often benefits their neighbors, the wider community, and the passerby. Here are some features that people can enjoy, and in one case, find a book. There are a variety of fences, some surviving from Victorian times. This is somewhat unusual in Ontario, where houses typically do not have front fences, or indeed lich gates. There are a variety of fences, some surviving from Victorian times. This is somewhat unusual in Ontario, where houses typically do not have front fences or lich gates. In the 1920s, many houses in the Niagara area were designed by the architectural practice of Nicholson and Macbeth. More about them later. One of the fascinating parts of some of these houses have been the side gates. Remember, 100 years ago, both milk and bread were delivered, and they, as well as other trades, went to the side entrances. In some of the houses, the mail slot still at the side entrance. Milk delivery, bread delivery have disappeared, but today, home delivery thrives again. And using very basic materials, some elegant side gates were designed by Nicholson and Macbeth. I like this as a very cost-efficient way of including a very nice element in a building. Now, not all of the gates are historic, but they have set an example for some newer efforts. I like this newer gate on the right. It has a permanent wreath on it, addressing two defining quirks of the community at once. Here's one Nicholson Macbeth gate, and it actually appears on the house drawings, but it looks as if the carpenter did a bit of free interpretation of his instructions. Most residents show respect for the heritage of the area and of the individual buildings, something not always shared by developers who have at times stripped older houses of their internal heritage features in an attempt to make them contemporary, whatever that means. The stone wall in the photograph at the left runs past several of today's houses. It's what remains from the Leonard estate, demolished in 1938. In the photograph at the right, a new roof material and design was carefully selected to match the slate that may have been originally in the house. The neighboring house still has its magnificent original slate roof. The area keeps evolving and new things appear. Personally, I find this a bit of an enigma. What fits and what doesn't in an area that has had 200 years of ongoing and varied evolution? It has no uniform pattern except variety. The house on the right was recently built by a St. Catharines developer as his own house. My sense is it fits in remarkably well with its relationships to the streets, and complete with, landscaping, still incomplete, and the wonderful porches. To the right of it is a small house, totally reconstructed a couple of years before. On the left is a different sort of house. You might have your own opinions about it, but it'll probably join comfortably with the diversity in the area. Here are two houses built on land severed from the back of a larger property. They're a bit of a study in contrast. One, a fairly good Georgian replica, the other, something more contemporary. Even though they're markedly different in style, their scale matches, as does the relationship to the street. Is this harmonious? What do you think? These houses are next to each other, and both relatively recent additions to the neighborhood. Some questions arise about the house on the right. How important should cars be to you? And what exactly is the relationship of cars to a neighborhood such as this? You might have opinions about this. The house in the foreground, if you can see it there, is in the Heritage District. The recently constructed condominium building next door is not. It's worth considering the influence of the architectural practice of Nicholson and Beth a bit more. Arthur Nicholson was local, with his family being active in business, in particular owning a mill footwork factory. Robert Macbeth was from Inverness in Scotland, where his father was a prominent architect. Nicholson had practiced as an architect before the First War, and a couple of his more interesting buildings survive nearby, but not in the Yates Street Heritage District. In Niagara, among architects, there has been a bit of a debate about which person was the amazing designer. Personally, my sense is that there was some sort of chemistry operating between them. It's worth having a look at the Niagara Society of Architects video entitled Domestic Gems, and it could be accessed through the Society's website. The Yates Street area tended to stabilize through the first decades of the 20th century. The spa hotels disappeared, Ridley College relocated, and St. Catharines prospered. The active Welland Canal no longer followed 12 Mile Creek past the area. Numbers of houses were built, replacing some of the large estates and hotels, or occupying spaces that had not been built upon before. At that time, the go-to firm of architects was obviously Nicholson and Macbeth, and people at that time seemed to want to build landmark houses. While there are remarkable Nicholson and Macbeth houses around Niagara, and a few beyond, the showcases are in the Yates Street Heritage District and the nearby Glenridge area. Here are two contrasting designs. The one's in the photographs. The other is actually the house with the little office in the corner. One of these follows the traditional English form, as do so many of the Nicholson and Macbeth houses, while the other one is Italianate, complete with a very nice tile roof. The English house, again built for one of the brewery owners after the children had grown up, was not primarily as a family house, but actually largely as a place for business entertainment. And in this photograph you can see just a corner of the wonderful slate roof. As we're talking mostly about streetscape matters in this talk, we'll not go into these houses, but both have spectacular interiors. The houses are usually seen as part of the arts and crafts movement, something that came to Canada after it was waning elsewhere. I find it personally amusing that local architect and historian Norm MacDonald, when selecting a background for the narration of the Domestic Gems video, chose to display a book on the British architect M.H. Bailey Scott entitled The Artistic House, written by Diane Haig, who died in 2022. Her husband and I collaborated on a number of research projects and publications. On the basis of some of the house details, Nicholson and Macbeth were obviously aware of the work of the British arts and crafts architects such as Bailey Scott. Remember that arts and crafts is more of a philosophy than a style, so it's subject to varying interpretation, and this being shortly after the First World War, with some of the houses constructed for people returning from the war, should not be surprising that most, but not all, of the products tend to be British-inspired. Based on surviving records, the first group of Nicholson and Macbeth houses consisted of 21, 23, and 25. Interestingly, Nicholson and Macbeth houses sometimes run in groups. One conjecture might be that Arthur Nicholson was building speculative houses himself, and where there were two for clients, he added a third, but that's total supposition. Number 21 was built first, commencing construction in mid-1922, followed shortly by number 23. What's interesting about these houses is they're all quite different. They comprise a collective streetscape with little space between them. Norm MacDonald in his video says, just enough room for a thin milkman. Number 21 presents itself as a modest story-and-a-half house, but the main floor is actually a full floor below street level, which is also the case for number 23, as houses on this side of Yates Street are built into the bank. Here's another group of 3 Nicholson and Macbeth houses that wrap around a street corner. Again, the semi-detached houses facing Norris Place, the ones at the top right, are bigger than they look. The roof hides a third floor, and some of the drawings of these houses still exist. And on the left is a little detail between the houses, detached, but just enough room for a thin milkman and a nice gate. Many questions flow from consideration of this area. What can be learned from it? Why did it work here? What characteristics are most important? And can they be replicated? Or do neighborhoods like this simply appear as a fluke? can we consciously arrange for such things to happen? It's always good to look at the numbers. The 2021 census does have information for a census tract that roughly aligns with the area of the Heritage District. We can compare those numbers with the numbers for St. Catharines as a whole to see how they differ. There are a couple of interesting things that can be observed in the data. Relative to the city, the proportion of people under age 20 is much smaller, but is considerably greater for people in their early 20s. There are proportionally many more aged over 85. One might think this is due to some long-term care facility or seniors apartment in the area, but there isn't one, although one is under construction in 2023. Perhaps the walkability of the area, with pleasant tree-shaded sidewalks and pedestrian access to many urban amenities, means people can remain in the area as they age. It is not necessary to have a car to live well in this area. Another factor might be the higher level of affluence, and we know that longevity and wellness are generally correlated with affluence. But the heritage area does not consist entirely of large residences. In fact, the availability of smaller units may encourage people to stay in the area, but downsize. Again, anecdotal evidence suggests this happens. As an older urban area, the population density is considerably higher than that of the city as a whole. This is interesting because of the size of some of the houses and the significant amount of open space behind some of them, but perhaps can be attributed to some of the narrower streets and houses with little setbacks from the streets. Of course, more analysis is always in order. All of this inevitably leads to the questioning of traditional planning approaches with uniform setbacks and coverage. Uniformity generally. Same size buildings, same uses, same height, same population, income groupings, same. The variety of house forms, and sometimes the division of larger houses into apartments, means that the Yates Street area contains a variety of income groups, and in some cases, as they've aged, people have been able to move into an apartment without leaving their own community. In today's world, this can also accommodate adult children to live with their parents as they develop their careers and seek out increasingly expensive housing of their own. And this is suggested by the population statistics and by anecdote. Perhaps uniformity is not the key to successful urban areas, but might actually be a detriment. Close proximity to commercial and retail uses is one characteristic of the Yates Street Heritage District. At-home working and having clients to the house goes back 200 years. Through the 1950s and 60s, we seem to have a horror of this, and there is a reason. Excavation of British Victorian neighbourhoods have revealed such at-home activities as nail making and glove making, with attendant cat raising, skinning, and tanning. Those sorts of things have major externalities. They affect neighbours with smells and noises. But an at-home accountant, computer programmer, insurance broker, or writer is more likely to be found in today's neighbourhoods, and they probably don't disturb the neighbours. The walkability of the Yates Street Heritage District is in distinct contrast to many of the low-density post-war suburbs in the Niagara area. Here are some photographs of such an area. Note that it lacks sidewalks, and that deters walking. And in some of these areas, I know from personal experience, walking or driving on the roads can be annoying or even dangerous because each has to constantly be watching out for the other. It's as if these areas were actually designed to deter social interaction. Walking works as a social glue, and dog walking links people. And again, here we see community interfaces. My sense is that this interface between private and public spaces is important. In the Yates Street area, many houses sit right on the sidewalk, and some have porches there too. Post-war suburbs typically have a deep front yard with mown grass. There have been interesting developments built on the edge of the Heritage District. To me, this suggests that the edges of our heritage conservation areas should have some sort of traditional mode. Again, here we have this Tudoresque Stokes house of 1941 and the adjacent new condominium building. The Heritage District was drawn to leave out some immediately adjacent developable sites, so the condominium building is not the only place where dissonant things have been built just outside the boundary. Heritage is a dynamic process, as demonstrated by the Yates Street area, and there has to be freedom to evolve. Perhaps in Canada we have not yet come fully to terms with the fact that areas do evolve, and decisions made long ago affect how that evolution occurs. In this area, it's clear that most residents respect the heritage of the area, and changes are usually made quite sensitively. There are many examples of how this has been manifested. Yet, such neighbourhoods may need special curating, but not be tangled in rigid red tape. They're not museums. If the Yates Street Heritage District was, we might have preserved the macaroni factory. Sometimes citywide regulations do not fit older or different neighbourhoods. Vital heritage neighbourhoods are not like 1960 suburbs and needed to be treated differently, in particular because of the influence of the car and parking requirements. So, how does one deal with neighbourhoods built before the dominance of cars? Somehow in the Yates Street Heritage District, it seems to work reasonably well, and each house seems to have found its own solution. The difficulty of predicting the future can be underlined. When I first saw this area all those years ago, it was considered as ripe for clearance and redevelopment, but it survived and in fact returned to its previous role as a distinctive neighborhood. Considering this area underlines the difficulty of predicting the future, in particular anything attached to land. This is because property matters relate to the long term. Most of our world consists of short-term physicality. Only a few physical assets last longer than a few decades. Better quality books and furniture can. But most long-lived creations are ethereal, including art, music, culture, and some ideas, both scientific and philosophical. These are the things we build upon. Buildings stand out because they take long periods of time to build, and their creation requires considerable resources, both physical and managerial. But buildings will endure only in certain economic contexts. In a dynamic, growing city, buildings are endangered by the need to intensify. In a community that has lost its economic reason for being, buildings likely gradually disappear till all that's left are fading memories and perhaps a mound that we entitled an abandoned medieval village or a rural crossroads, marked only by a cemetery. Buildings, and indeed communities, tend to survive when not much changes. Hence we have around the world some preserved villages. Lavenham in the east of England is one, where little has changed over hundreds of years. It neither grew nor completely failed economically. Why did the Yates Street area survive, together with many of its older buildings? One likely explanation is that the population did not grow. The commercial centre of St. Catharines, that might have grown during the post-World War II period, was sideswiped by suburban malls. Fairview Mall was one of the first enclosed shopping centres in Canada, and the Penn Centre, which gradually grew from an open 1950s strip shopping centre into a major regional mall, meant that with adequate free parking and the closure of the NS&T tram system, the city centre gradually stagnated, so did not expand into nearby areas such as Yates Street. And what of the future for the Yates Street Heritage District? One is that evolution should not be stopped. It's not a museum. What's interesting is that new construction continues in the area, with new houses filling in between large houses with their large lots, or demolishing smaller dwellings to build larger ones. It's fascinating how the area has inspired some very nice infill, although there's some unfortunate exceptions. Oh well, in the sheltered climate below the escarpment, ivy grows very well. Future attitudes are important and yet impossible to predict. The Yates Street area survived urban growth, flourished in the roaring 20s, was threatened by functionalist modernizing thoughts of the First World War II period. My suspicion is that having survived for 200 years, it is now valued for its age, and will likely to continue to be esteemed by the people who live there, but it may function very differently. I will leave it at that, and hope that you think more about what makes successful long-lived, and esteemed communities. Look out for these pockets when you see them and learn. And if you're in the building world, try to include some of their features in your future projects. If you live in a community, think before you act as far as opposing new development. You never know. It might not be the same as you see now, but it might actually improve the overall community. I'm not going to thank you for watching this. You should thank me. But assembling something like this does help me think through how we should be making better places in our cities, better places in which to live. There are many factors. It's such a complex area, and I've only touched on a few. What I would really like is that when you encounter neighborhoods, that you think a bit more about them.